Verse 14 says, "For it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property." Well, first things first, for it will be like. What's the first thing we want to know? What's the it? What's he referring to? Well, how do you find that out? We need something that's called context. And I want to illustrate the importance of knowing context to you. If I were to show you this picture, let's show that first slide, Nate. Okay, what do you think that picture is about? Give me some thoughts. Man, woman? Looks like a guy, probably. How do you know they're in a boat? Looks like to me he's looking off a building. It must be windy. He's got a scarf on. That's about as much as we can tell right now. Don't we want to have more context? How do we find more context? You know what? We draw back and we look at more of the picture. Let's look at the next picture. Oh, Janice was right. Did you look at my sermon notes this morning, dear? That's my wife who said that. He is in a boat. Go, Janice. He's wearing a coonskin cap. That gives us some interesting information. Helps us to date the picture a little bit, doesn't it? I still want to know more about what's going on. How about you? One person says, yeah, come on, do you want to know more? How do we find out the context? We draw back and we look at more of the picture. Next picture fills out the story. Oh, it's George Washington crossing the Delaware. This is the power of knowing context. So, how do we know what's going on in this story? Well, we have to draw back and look at the big picture. And if we do that, we'd realize that this story in Matthew 25 is actually part of 3 stories, one after another, that Jesus tells in chapter 25. The parable of the 10 virgins, the parable of the talents, and the parable of the sheep and the goats. And the beginning of the first parable in verse 1, Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins. Oh, well, there's the answer. There's the it. Jesus is teaching about the kingdom of heaven. Well, I want to know, why is Jesus teaching about the kingdom of heaven here? How do we find out? We draw back and look at more of the picture. And when we do that, we realize that this teaching in chapter 25 is linked to what Jesus is teaching in chapter 24. It's all one big block of teaching. And you pull back to the beginning of chapter 24 and look at what's happening there. Jesus and the disciples have just walked out of the temple. The temple is an amazing building, and the disciples are oohing and aahing at it. And Jesus just randomly says, you know, you see this great temple here? Not one stone will be left upon another. And then he's like, quiet. He throws this verbal hand grenade in there just to kind of mess with their minds. And sure enough, the disciples' minds are blown. Jesus does this a lot. Next verse, the disciples asked Jesus, when? When is this going to happen? When's the temple coming down? And Jesus proceeds in the rest of chapter 24 to tell them. He lists signs of what will take place, of all the hardship and trouble that's going to come on the world before the temple is destroyed, and it happens 40 years later. And then Jesus goes on in the chapter, and he talks about his second coming, because the disciples also want to know about that. And he says to them that there'll be hardships and troubles and difficult signs to look for. In other words, here's how I want you to think. Here's how I want you to act in a world that's starting to fall apart. And then he goes on in chapter 25 and tells these 3 stories to say to them, how do you be the church in a pandemic? You live for the kingdom of heaven.